Hey everybody, and just another episode of Tim Rambles On About Wine. We're going to take and talk about oxygen management in terms of two wines that are on polar ends of the spectrum in terms of their phenolic makeup. And we're going to walk you through how you can use not only juice chemistry to wine chemistry, sort of 101, but then I also want to kind of go to the really advanced level where we're really going to get into looking into phenolics and modifying those phenolics using different types of oxygen management. So here's the two groups that we have here, and I'm going to talk about their goals. So the Tempranillo group on the left, they really liked the 2018 Tempranillo and kind of wanted to match that style. The only thing we saw that was different was that color was down about 30 or 40% from the 2018 vintage, and tannin was up. So we had a tremendous amount of tannin to work with, and not a whole lot of anthocyanins to work with. So we really had to think about that. But then in terms of juice chemistry, we also were pretty aggressive about adding acid up front because we agreed that many of the Tempranillos we had had just ended up too fat. So a little bit more engineered, but definitely followed a lot of the same winemaking steps we did in 2018, but really controlled the extraction. The Malbec, on the other hand, really wanted to go for purity. And this is a really fun group of people because you've got what appears to be almost like dad and daughters, and it cracks me up. But they're a great group, and they just wanted pure fruit-driven Malbec. And they had a boatload of color to work with, a moderate amount of tannin, and they didn't want to do any stem inclusion, nothing funky, just pure fruit. And I think we achieved those goals pretty well. So when we look at the basic chemistry on these two wines, you go, well, they're really not a whole heck of a lot different. I mean, we got pretty similar bricks. The pH on the Tempranillo is high because that's our Tempranillo, and it always is. Well, it was. It's gone now. And so we knew that we were probably going to have to do something just looking at basic chemistry. But really, at the end of the day, you got a TA of 6.1 and 7.5, and it's probably just fine, right? Well, no. We need to have more than just bricks, pH, and TA if we want to take these wines to the places where they need to be. So when we actually look at glucose and fructose on these two, they are very different. So the Tempranillo actually has quite high glu-fru. And if we're going to do that and convert it over, the Tempranillo is going to need a little bit of water. Even though the bricks look similar, when we actually got down to measures of sugar, we need to do something. So this needed a little bit of a water back. The Malbec also needed a little bit of a water back. We needed to get those down to about 250 grams a liter of glu-fru. So we watered both of them back. But with the Tempranillo, we added acid to acidulate the water, and we added acid on top of that. And I'll break that down here in a little bit. And then the Malbec, we didn't add any acid to. We just watered it back. And I'm going to show you why that is. And the reality is knowing is half the battle. So what about malic, tartaric, and potassium? So let's get into these in really good detail. And this is something I kind of bang on about, but I want to go ahead and take this and break this down in a little bit more of a graphical form so you can see it. So the Tempranillo, we have a bit of a problem. So first off, we have quite a bit of, not a whole lot of tartaric acid, and we have a whole lot of malic. I mean, look at that malic number, 6 grams of malic. So the TA was at 6.1. That doesn't account for anything. We obviously heavily buffered by potassium. And because of the acid matrix, we know that malic acid is going to deplete pretty significantly, and we're going to see a big pH shift. So we've got a few things working against this. Number one, in the Tempranillo, we've got lots of potassium. We're already at pH 3.7, which is above that pH 3.6 isoelectric point, where you're going to see not only your acid drop out when that potassium hooks up with that tartaric acid, you're also going to see your pH rise. On the other side, we've got Malbec over here, and the majority of the acid in this is tartaric, and there's only a modest amount of malic. So, and the potassium isn't nearly as high, and the pH is at that like 3.3 something. So when we do have that initial potassium bitartrate precipitation early on in this wine, we're going to see not only the acid drop, but the pH is probably going to go down too. So we've got, a much more favorable acid situation in the Malbec. So I kind of wanted to do this, and I want to visualize how acid shifts. So if we take our total acidity in both of these wines and we just measured them in the absence of potassium and everything else and just put tartaric on top of malic, we've got close to over 9 grams a liter of actual real acid in the Tempranillo. And then we've got over 10 in the Malbec, which is a lot. So, the TA in juice, you always hear me say it's pretty pointless. Well, I think this is a pretty good example of the difference in what, real total acidity is versus titratable acidity. So now we're going to do our first step. And the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to have potassium bitartrate precipitation. Now, the reasons for that, number one, is as soon as we crush that grape open, the potassium and the tartaric acid can interact. So that's going to start as soon as we have juice. But as fermentation progresses, potassium bitartrate becomes less and less soluble, which means as the alcohol rises, the more of it's going to fall out. And we can estimate about how much of that is going to stick around in a wine. And I generally think that somewhere around 700 to 1,000 milligrams a liter of potassium are going to stick around. So basically, every other piece beyond that is going to precipitate out some tartaric acid. Now realize it doesn't interact with malic, only tartaric. So after we go through that estimated potassium bitartrate precipitation, our Tempranillo is going to be down to an actual TA of somewhere under 8, whereas the Malbec is still going to be over 9. But also realize the pH shift that's going to happen in the Malbec, because the Malbec's below that 365 pH, not only are you going to have precipitation, you're going to have pH drop. Tempranillo, you're going to have precipitation, you're going to have pH rise. So that's also important. Again, pH and TA aren't perfectly perfectly linear, but it is important to recall that. All right, then we're going to move on to step 2. So after that potassium precipitation, where we have that dropout of tartaric acid due to potassium bitartrate precipitation, the next thing that's going to happen is we're going to take that wine through malolactic fermentation. And generally all reds go through malo because of the length of time we have to leave them in barrel and things like that. It's a good idea to do that. You don't have to, but it's generally what we do with red wine. So after we go through malolactic fermentation, you can see that in the case of the Tempranillo, if we do nothing, our titratable acidity is going to end up somewhere down in the 4s, which is going to be really fat. That's going to be a really fat wine, regardless of pH. Anything down with a titratable acidity in the 4s is just going to be overtly fat on the palate. Whereas the Malbec, on the other hand, even though they came in with really similar titratable acidities, just TA, but when we actually looked at the real acid, it's a very different scenario. The Malbec, after it converts, is going to have a tremendously high acid. I mean, a red wine with a TA in the 7s is going to be pretty blisteringly puckery. So this is why we're going to have to add acid to the Tempranillo, and we're going to just water back the Malbec just to sort of reduce that natural acid. So this is how we sort of base our acid adjustment on something, is that basically we want to add a little bit of Tempranillo to the Tempranillo, and we're going to add just a half a gram a liter to get it into that 5 range. And then we're just going to take the Malbec and literally water it back. And in that water back, which we're going to cut it back about 10 or so percent, we're also going to reduce the acidity in the process just by simply watering it back. So the Tempranillo, we're going to go ahead and add a little acid, and you can see where that's going to end up on the graph, whereas Malbec, we don't add any, but what actually happens is because we water it back, we shift that down a little bit and reduce the acidity a bit and get into that, 6, mid to high 6 range, which is a reasonable number. That's going to still be pretty acidic, but it's probably not going to be overtly so. And in the long run, I think that'll integrate nicely. So here we are with our estimation of final TA. We'll see how we did, but we're going to shoot for around 5.1, 5.2 on the Tempranillo, which is still pretty low in the grand scheme of things. And then we're going to shoot for that kind of mid 6s on the Malbec. So the question is, how did it work? Well, here we are. This is the final TA in tartaric acid equivalents. So TA in wine is really, really good. It really is strongly correlated with how we taste things. So TA in juice is pointless, but in wine, it is a very useful metric for telling us how sour our wine is going to be. And I think as you taste these wines, you're going to see that difference that just 1.5 grams of acid can make in the wine. So Tempranillo, still probably a little on the fatter side, but it's got a lot of tannin. And remember, tannin enhances acidity. So in a high tannin wine, a little lower acidity may not exactly be a bad thing. And then the Malbec still got some racy acid. We may choose to deacidify that a little bit, or we may choose to kind of keep it there. We'll have to see where it goes. But it's always a little bit better to have too much acid than too little. If you kind of have a little bit too much acid, you can always dial that back with potassium bicarbonate or potassium carbonate a week or two before bottling. more like a month or two before bottling. And then you can keep your pH low because taking acid out doesn't have the deleterious effects of doing like a late stage acid add. So I always recommend that if you're going to do an acid adjustment, do it up front. And then if you just overshot by a little bit, you can always dial it back because that won't knock the wine around as bad as adding acid late in the game. So let's talk about pH because these two are fairly intertwined. So here's our pH of the juice, the Tempranillo juice, and here's the Tempranillo wine. And so see how in the Malbec juice, it only came up to 365. So we have a textbook wine with the Malbec. And the reason why it came up is that it probably initially dropped because of the potassium bitartrate precipitation, but then we went through malolactic fermentation. And anytime you go through malo, even if the numbers are low, you're going to see a pretty significant rise in pH. So we come in at this pH 365, which if you could write a textbook for a wine, TA in the sixes with a pH of 3.6 something is as absolute textbook as it gets. Whereas the Tempranillo, on the other hand, even with that acid add, even with going after it, our pH is still ridiculously high, pH 416. And that is just, an aberration in the grand scheme of things. And we were very thankful for cross-flow filters because taking this wine to bottle without getting rid of some of the microbes could be really an unpleasant thing. We'd probably get a big pediococcus bloom or something in the bottle. So what I like to talk about is holy shift. So this is that idea of pH shift. And you guys are like, great, why'd you take me through that? I mean, we're here to talk about oxygen management, right? Well, yeah, but it's all encompassing. Everything plays off everything else. So the final titratable acidity on a wine has a very strong impact on tannin perception. So if we had a high acid wine with high tannin, you're going to have an increased perception of astringency. And then lower acid will help mask that astringency. You can even mask it with a little sugar later on if you wanted to get more interventionist. But the things we want to do is go ahead and make sure that we are managing our acid in accordance with the type of phenolic material we have. So knowing basic acid matrix and knowing basic sugar matrix are really important to building the wine style that you want. So kind of start there as the foundational building blocks, and then we move on to kind of the advanced stuff, the 300-400 level enology, which is kind of where we're at with this, looking at oxygen management. So here's the current wine chemistry on these two. We were shooting for 14.5% alcohol. The ethanol in Tempranillo is 14.56 versus 14.71 on the Malbec. And our pHs are perfect. And the titratable acidities are about where they should be. It's a low for the Tempranillo, but the titratable acidity for the Malbec is just perfectly moderate. And then we look at VA. VA on Tempranillo, 0.59 grams a liter is still low in the grand scheme of things, but the Malbec is ludicrously low. At 0.34 grams a liter. It's one of the lowest red wine VAs I've ever seen. And I just attribute that to a very moderate amount of malolactic fermentation and just a really clean, well-moderated ferment because they wanted to really go for fruitiness. They didn't want to withhold any nutrient. So we gave it everything it needed and it powered right through ferment and just ended up with a really super clean ferment. So let's talk about tannin. Again, everything happens in the vineyard. I want to keep beating you over the head on this. Canopy management is a big thing. Leaf removal and timing is really important. Also, abusing your fruit. So high tannin sites frequently have high wind and the grapes get abused. So between sunshine and just getting whipped around, those all cause tannins and phenolics to increase. And also, the longer you hang the fruit out, the more the tannin's going to go up. And remember, tannin's a big mishmash of stuff. So the longer you hang it, there's some oxidative things that start happening, oxygen management literally in the fruit as it's hanging out and oxidizing and starting to shrivel a little bit. You're going to get more tannin just due to that oxidation that's happening in the fruit sitting out there. Other things we can do is do stem inclusion or removal. Those impact tannin quite a bit. When we get into experimental wines next week, we'll talk about that. Another thing you can do if you want to have a little more tannin is do a saignée, which is a bleed. Take some juice out. If you've got a vineyard site that tends to be a little bit weak, and make some rosé out of it. Other things that are big drivers are the temperature of the fermentation or temperature of just the cap or the must. And again, the Tempranillo, we did the cold ferment with a hot extract. And then the ethanol content of a wine also helps hold tannin into solution. Enzymes and adding enzymes has an impact. They will help extract more if you add extraction enzymes, and also length of time on skins. And about length of time on skins, one thing I want to mention is it isn't linear how much tannin you continue to extract. You kind of reach a peak, usually somewhere between 5 and probably 15 days. And then after that, the tannins begin to sort of polymerize and fall out. There's been a lot of research on that. And either they polymerize and fall out, or sort of because the yeast and everything are still in suspension, you have sort of a self-fining effect with those yeast pulling tannin out. But you do get kind of peak extraction after only a number of series of days. And then after that, you'll actually start to have a precipitation event. So let's talk about the tannin that we had and what we brought in. So the Tempranillo has plenty. So when we brought it in, we were looking at a lot in the Tempranillo, and we knew we wanted to extract enough to taste, but we didn't want to go too over the top. So we had to be really careful with how much we brought in. But again, then the Malbec, on the other hand, is really moderate. But the good news is with the Malbec, we're going to have a little bit more acidity to enhance tannin perception. Whereas Tempranillo, we know we got low acid, so we can probably push those tannin numbers up just a little bit. So approaches to managing tannin, we did these very differently. So the Tempranillo, we did a cold soak first to get as much color as we could because it was a low color variety. We had lots of tannin, but very moderate color. I'll get onto that in a minute. We did a destem only. We did a slow, cool fermentation. We did punch downs just once a day. And then post-primary fermentation, we heated it and we kept measuring extraction by taste. And then we basket pressed it in order to make sure that we didn't over extract it. We were really gentle on it. Whereas Malbec was straightforward, nothing fancy. We destemmed it, we crushed it, we fermented it 8 days on skins. We didn't do punch downs on it. We just did simple pump overs. And then right afterwards, we just pressed it in the bladder press, and it was as keep it simple, stupid as you can ever expect. So I want to talk about catechin. We've talked about this before, but this is that indication that that there's a lignification of seeds. Catechin is high early in the season, and then as the fruit hangs out longer and longer, catechin continues to go down, and it's just an indicator of seed ripeness. There's many other factors involved, but it doesn't just go down, it's just getting knitted up and turned into tannin. So it's in the highest quantities in seeds and stems, and our way of managing it is through canopy management in the vineyard, leaf stripping and shoot thinning. And then also another thing that plays a role into catechin development is just moderating your crop load to keep it down. And another thing that's interesting is older vines tend to produce more catechin, all things being equal. So they tend to not get the seed quite as ripe. And that's one thing we did a study a while ago, and we did vine age, we did Cabernet all over the state. And the one thing that increased pretty linearly was that catechin went up. And so catechin is a seediness, it gives wine a dustiness. And I think maybe it's what gives that notion that old vines give more structure to the wine. And it's the older the vine gets, the harder time it has kind of knitting up all those tannins later on. But again, every variety is very, very different. So let's take a look at these, and I just want to throw them out there. There's not much to begin with in either of these. There wasn't a whole lot in the Tempranillo, and then we just ended up with less in the wine, and we tend to see that because the catechin will tend to knit up with other stuff. But the Malbec I thought was pretty interesting because we had so many anthocyanins, and anthocyanins are so reactive that I think the anthocyanins and catechins reacted to make some more polymeric anthocyanins. So we see that big reduction in the Malbec. So these are things we want to talk about. And this is where rubber really meets the road, is with anthocyanins. So Malbec is already known to have large quantities of anthocyanins. It's probably one of the reddest varieties I've ever seen. I very rarely see anything that has numbers as high as the Malbec. Tempranillo is a little different beast. It has moderate amounts. It's a fairly high tannin variety, but only moderately colored. And so these anthocyanins are produced in response to early sun exposure during berry set. So leaf stripping around berry set, and then again, canopy management. And another thing that it also impacts anthocyanins is nutrient. If you put a lot of fertilizer on your plants in an attempt to get your yans up, in that process, you will cause your grapes to have less anthocyanins. So it's a trade-off that you kind of have to go through. So our goal in any case is to have our peak anthocyanin development coincide with sugar, acid, and tannin ripeness. So have all of these things line up that you get your peak anthocyanins, and that's when you pick, because that's when you have the most highly reactive material to go in and polymerize and build your tannin structure. So let's take a look at these two. And in the case of the Tempranillo, we only had a moderate amount. As a matter of fact, what we generally want to see is at least, I like to see 2 to 1, 2 parts of anthocyanins to 1 part tannin. And in the Tempranillo, we were close to 1 to 1, about 1.5 to 1. And so that's a challenge, because you've got all the tannin in the world, but it's going to be really tough to polymerize. That one's going to end up, no matter what we do, probably pretty dusty unless we were to just not extract it hardly at all and gone for a lighter style. But that wasn't the group's goal. They wanted to make a wine that would age and last, because it's our last Tempranillo we're going to make. We wanted to make it haul as long as we could. Whereas the Malbec, we had tons of color, super colorful. And so we want to see where they go. And so here's where they were in the fruit, and here's where they are in the wine. Now remember, they're very labile compounds. And so what we see is a reduction in them pretty significantly. So they're going to diminish rapidly. So what we started with in the beginning, we ended up with a lot less. And I think the Tempranillo wine, the reason why they're as high as they are in the Tempranillo wine was that, cold soak up front, and just every attempt that we had to maintain anthocyanins as good as we could, in regards to extraction. Whereas the Malbec, we had plenty of color, and we moxed it, and we wanted to make sure that it got all knitted up. So I want to do a quick detour on pH and anthocyanins. So take those 2 glasses and hold them up. And, we've heard me talk about this before, but I think this is a really good opportunity to see how pH affects your color. Because, we really aren't differing a whole lot. There's a little, a fair amount more anthocyanins in the Malbec still, maybe 20% or so. But the big difference is look at the difference in color. That Malbec is fluorescent almost. It's iridescent, because that pH is sitting right on that 3.6 number, which is that bright red range, where we've got a little, not bright red range, but more in that flavillum form, where we've got just this really beautiful red color. Whereas the Tempranillo is much higher. And the quinodal form, the violet form of anthocyanin, is not as brightly colored, and it's just not as colored. So I think the Tempranillo, you actually can look at it, you can see the tannin. It's almost brown. You'll see that more brownish hue, and that's just simply tannin. Tannin's brown. It's a big knitted up pile of stuff, just like a seed, brown seed in the grape. So you see that shift, and then you'll also see how pH, when you get these high pH wines, not only aren't quite as colorful, but if they're high tannin, you get more into that auburn hue. So pretty cool. All right, moving into polymeric anthocyanins. Again, we've talked about this. It's associated with tannins through a complex set of reactions. Again, oxygen, which makes acetaldehyde and acetaldehyde pyruvate, and both of those compounds are made by yeast, or we can actually produce them by adding oxygen to the wine and driving ethanol chemically into acetaldehyde. And so through any of the oxygenation steps we talked about in the last lecture. So the thing is that the colored forms of anthocyanins combined with grape and wine polymers, they become significant contributors to color expression and color stability. The degree of modification or polymerization is directly correlated with astringency. So the more modified, the more polymeric anthocyanins to tannins we have, that's going to let us know how astringent that wine's going to be from an empirical standpoint. So here we go. Let's talk about what we did. So the Tempranillo, we did everything. Cryomaceration, dry ice addition up front, 4-day cold soak, cool fermentation with macrolox. Then we heated it to post-primary fermentation. We basket pressed it. We meso-oxed it post-pressing. And then We micro-oxed it as good as we could with our tools, but we did hold it for 3 weeks in the barrel room, cool, and added a little bit of meso-ox to it every day in our best ability to go ahead and see what kind of polymerization we could get. And so I think all of those steps really worked because we took a wine that didn't have a whole lot of anthocyanins to begin with, and we got all of them out. And then through working really, really hard at every step, we were able to polymerize that as much as we could. But that number's pretty small when you start to think about the ratio of actual tannin. Then Malbec, we just kind of made it. We macro-oxed it during ferment, we pumped it over, and then we pressed it before dryness. We pressed it early. So we were trying to make a silky smooth wine, and we definitely got a little bit more, some good polymeric anthocyanins. We could have made unlimited supply had we have wanted to, but we wanted to have it in line with the amount of tannin in there. We didn't want to make it just overtly polymerized, so it's just a big fat thing on your palate. You wanted to have some weight of tannin there, so we were looking to get that a nicely balanced wine. So we just didn't push it too hard. It doesn't say that there was a meso-ox on it, but I think we meso-oxed it a couple times in barrel just as a general principle, but not too much. Just a pretty hands-off approach. So this is where we want to talk about the plushness index. And so the aggressive polymerization on Tempranillo yielded pretty good results. 0.74 is not overtly terribly astringent, considering we're sitting on close to 1,000 milligrams a liter of tannin, 850 or something like that. That is pretty significant. So this wine should be a little bit dusty and things like that. The Malbec, on the other hand, is really, really polymerized. 0.9 is smooth as it gets. I mean, that is smooth in terms of a ratio. You'll get up around 1 on that polymeric anthocyanin tannin ratio, and you're going to have a really, really rounded wine. But what we want to talk about here is that sort of perception. The Tempranillo is probably going to taste a little bit dusty, but fortunately the acid's low that it's probably not overtly in your face. The Malbec probably still tastes like it's got some good tannin to it, even though it doesn't have a whole lot, because of that where acid goes into influencing the way that we sense astringency with tannin. So pretty cool experiment. So here, let's do a takeaway on this. So Tempranillo, we had high tannin wine with only moderate anthocyanin content. That's a really tricky wine to make. So we did a really aggressive approach to polymerizing using oxygen. And then that low acid helps bring that tannin structure into balance. Malbec, on the other hand, we didn't have to worry about anything. It was just there. The anthocyanins were 3 to 1. Didn't have to do anything. It was going to happen naturally. Just let her rip. So we had everything to do to just make the wine. And then that higher acid will bring that perception of tannin and weight. I think it's probably, both of these are probably a little out of whack right now. The Tempranillo's a little knock-kneed because it's not even a year old yet. And then the Malbec, on the other hand, is also probably similar, where the acid's really kind of showing right this minute. And that'll kind of work its way through and step back as time goes on. But pretty cool. This is a way to problem solve, approach, and use all the data available to make wine. And so if you were to just get the basic chemistry on that Tempranillo and you'd never worked with that vineyard before, you could have mucked that wine up pretty good. On the other hand, the Malbec, you probably could have just made it. You didn't need anything but PHTA and Brix because the fruit was so good. You just nailed it. So this is one of those things where some winemakers think they're amazing because they just get great fruit all the time and make wine out of it, and everything's been done for them in the vineyard. They just buy from that vineyard that produces great fruit year in, year out. Whereas sometimes you've got to work it a little bit, and knowing is half the battle. And that's all, folks. That's practical juice to wine chemistry, and then oxygen management all the way through. Hopefully those wines are showing well for you.